World. There you go, Dan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Two Wise Guys. I think this is episode 16. I'm not really sure. I missed last week. But I'm Dan,
Yeah, where were
and
you?
last week, I don't even remember what was happening last week. I was really busy, and we were having stuff going on. I can't remember like 3 days ago, so I don't know what I was doing last week. But Chris, you did a great job. I enjoyed watching the show last week. Um, and we haven't got the audio version published yet, but it turned out good. It'll come out soon, as soon as I have time to upload it. But Chris, you're rocking a stellar mustache there, sir.
Oh, thank you, Dan. I'm just trying to emulate you as
Oh,
the guy who always has the great beards and stuff. So,
oh, I
and
got the
for
beard.
once, actually cold in California. Go figure. We went through the whole entire holiday season and had weather in the 70s and 80s, and then late February comes along, and it's almost springtime, and I guess that's when the weather's supposed to turn cold here. I don't know. So the
Strange.
beard
What
felt appropriate.
what temperature is it out there?
It's like 65-ish. Okay, so it's not that cold. Okay, it's not that cold, but it's colder than it has been. Definitely wearing heavy jacket weather for us here. Relative cold is a relative thing, I guess.
Yeah, no, yeah, it is. Yeah, we like right now we're getting highs in the 60s again, and it's getting down into the 30s at night. But yeah, there was a point in I think it was mid January and maybe even late December where it was getting down into like the teens at night, and it was highs in the low 30s, and so it was not your cup of tea, I'm assuming.
Oh, that's cold. And interestingly enough, I was telling a few people, friends and coworkers and whatnot, oh, it's so great to have this cold weather. But when I talked to you and just now realizing that it's really not that cold, in the grand scheme of things. Yeah, I mean, I probably wouldn't be wanting to have weather in the teens, but the high 30s, low 40s, a doable thing
Well,
at
yeah, I mean,
night.
I work overnight outside, man. Those nights sucked. It was so cold. It was terrible. But
I do
thankfully
not.
things are looking up. I've actually got the other day I wore shorts and a t-shirt at work, and it was great. It felt wonderful outside.
Like, was it like 60,
It
70?
was 55, I think.
Wow, dude. I mean, 55. I'm wearing a jacket, pants, and boots with maybe two layers of socks, and then like a double shirt and all that stuff just to make sure everything's all good.
You got the thin blood right now from being down Southern California. But if I was still living in Florida and it was 55, I would not be dressed like that. That's for sure. But
You're like those people from Wisconsin, or you're like those northern states, or like Canada, and they show up, and it's like the super cold out. Everybody's wearing jackets, and then they're like wearing flip flops and a shorts and a t-shirt, and you're like, what?
weren't you
Where?
born in Canada?
I was, but that doesn't, that was a long time ago, 30 plus years ago.
A lot's changed.
But I mean, somebody who's like constantly living there, I guess is that true? I hear that thin blood thing get thrown around. Is that like actually true? Or is that sort of like a wives' tale? I wonder.
I don't think it's true. It's more of your body just gets acclimated to the climate you're in. Like,
Gotcha. It's like when you get into a cold shower and it starts feeling kind of warm towards the end of it, and because you got used to it, and then like somebody else gets in the shower, like your wife, and she's like, "Oh my God, it's so cold." I'm like, "Oh, it felt pretty decent to me."
yeah, I guess so. Yeah, yeah. I think that's all it is. It's kind of like it's. Yeah, I guess the extreme version would be that, or like getting into a pool and then you get used to it or something. But it's just like like when you're living in LA or you live in Central Florida or something, and it's really hot, and all of a sudden you like if you don't run the AC constantly, you get used to it being hot, and then it's not quite as bad. I mean, it's still miserable, but it's not quite as miserable as it would have been otherwise. But
Yeah, it's true. Come to think of it, we don't really use AC very much here, even in the summer. At least not like in Florida. Um, Living in Florida, you basically have to, unless you want to die a slow, agonizing death, almost
uh,
literally. But from the humidity. Um, but it's strange. Like in Southern California, the temperatures are very similar, but I guess because of the lack of relative humidity, people just don't really use their air conditioning very frequently here.
I could
People
see
just
that.
windows open.
Yeah, Columbia is usually really hot in the summer. Like I remember when you were living in Houston, I talked to you one time and you were saying it was like 94 degrees, and it was so hot, and it was 115 for the fourth straight day here. It gets, I don't know what it is. Columbia is just stupid hot. Like the catchphrase for the city is famously hot. There's no real explanation for it. Um,
Famously
Char-
hot.
yeah,
I like
Charleston's not
Pickering.
that bad. Greenville's not bad. None of the other surrounding areas. Atlanta's not even that hot, but it just Columbia. It's just something about where we're sitting. I guess it just gets miserable, and it's super humid. Because like we'll go up to Asheville up in the mountains, and it can still be a fairly warm day, and but the humidity's not there, and you can walk around all day long and not break a sweat. It's the strangest thing, I guess.
Is Columbia surrounded by like mountains or hills or anything like that?
I think there's some. I mean, it's a kind of a hilly area. I think, yeah, it probably is down in somewhat of a valley, not a deep one, but it it's part of South Carolina where it's built on the juncture of three different rivers that come through here, so it is a bit further down, but it's not in the mountains. We're in what's called the Midlands here. So there's the Low Country, which is like Charleston and Myrtle Beach and that area down there near the coast, and then the Midlands is where Columbia is and kind of the surrounding areas, and then I think they call it the High Country. I can't remember what they call it around here, but that's where like Greenville and Spartanburg are up towards the mountains. Um, but yeah, there's a whole lesson of geography that goes along with barbecue here too. It's a whole culture thing. It's really interesting that we can talk about some other time. But
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're gonna get into our show here, but um, just feel like we're gonna kind of skip the news a little bit because, gosh,
because
I
the
just
news
don't I
sucks.
just don't feel like doing the news today because it's just so depressing. I mean, almost all the time when you're reading the news, it's just like something bad happened, and then you're like, oh God. And anytime there's like an event, like we got the Oscars coming up, this is it tomorrow or sometime like this weekend or something, and you just know everything's going to be politicized and racialized and all this, and it's like I don't even want to turn on anything that's remotely going to have any any chance of having political implications. And it's just maybe that's a conversation in and of itself if we kept kind of bogged down somewhere else. But um, as far as the sort of taking sides, making teams, sort of thing, whole ball game. But before I get anywhere down there, Dan, I think you wanted to share some articles, a couple articles and information about homeschooled weirdos. Was it?
Yeah, it was an interesting article that I read earlier. My wife sent it to me. She got it off of Facebook from one of her homeschool mom friends. And for those of you who are not aware, we homeschool our kids. So we've done the whole kind of gamut of schooling options. We had our kids in public school for a little while. Um, we also had them in a couple of charter schools. So they weren't private schools, but they weren't like the normal traditional public kind of model. Um, we've never done private schools because they're just too expensive. But we did. We're currently homeschooling. We've homeschooled them in the past, and it seems to work well for our family. And the kids all like being together. Um, and so she got this article, and it kind of caught her eye because one of our big things is we don't want our kids to grow up being the weird homeschool kids, and which I no knock on people who have the weird homeschool kids. You may not think their kids are weird, but probably are because ours are too, to be honest. But the big idea of the article is it kind of contrasts the idea of the weird homeschool kids to the culture of conformity that's within school. So um, I thought it was a really interesting article. I'll screen share it so we can kind of go through it if you want. Um, but like I said, there's nothing wrong with having kids that are considered weird, but that's kind of what the point that this guy tries to make in the article is that it's kind of a subjective view of what's normal, if that makes sense. And so this is an article by B.K. Marcus. The title of the article is "Homeschooled Weirdos and the Culture of Conformity: Not Seeming Weird Carries Its Own Costs." And this is from a website called the something what's it called Foundation for Economic Education. Excuse me. I believe that this is. I've never really seen the site before, so I think it's some sort of a homeschool advocacy group. So just be aware if any of you are going to check it out later on. This is a very much a pro homeschool argument, and a lot of the articles on this site seem to be that way too. So I think it's some sort of a homeschool advocacy group. But it's an interesting article. It provokes a lot of thought. And he references a few other articles and studies that have been done in the past that you might find interesting as well. And it talks about asking kind of what the definition of socialization is, because the main argument people have against homeschooling, or the concern that people have when you tell them that you homeschool, is, what are you doing about what are you doing about having your kids to be socialized, to be able to fit into society? And the author talks about a previous article that he had written called "Homeschooling, Socialization, and the New Groupthink," which I'll also have linked in the show notes for anyone who wants to read it. And it is he gives his definition that he had kind of been running within that previous article, which is that socialization is ensuring that a child becomes more sociable, or becomes sociable, so that he or she can develop the intelligence and social reflexes that promote peaceful and pleasurable interactions. Now, he kind of contrasts that with a definition that was sent in by a third grade school teacher named Heather Lakemacher. That it was a comment on his Facebook page that was submitted after he posted the article. And she defined it as simply not seeming weird. And I don't know if any of you who, like me, went through the public school system, if any of you ever have met homeschool kids along the way who just seemed a bit off. And I think a lot of times it's just because they're kind of quirky. They're interested in what they're interested in. And, as a homeschool family, we encourage our kids to find their things that they're interested in, and to just study them. Like as adults, we find things that we're interested in, and we invest time and energy into studying those things, which is why we are able to learn more about them. So, one day I remember wanting to get into archery, but I couldn't afford to go buy a new bow. I wanted to make a long bow. Excuse me, sorry. And so what I did was I went online and I found everything I could find out about bows and arrows, long bows, recurve bows, everything like that. And I ended up making one out of PVC and reinforcing it with fiberglass rods, and it fired great. And I was able to actually go out and shoot with it, shoot accurately, do some target practice. I even hit a running squirrel one time. That was pretty sweet. But the whole idea of it is, if you're interested in something, you're going to want to study it. You're going to want to learn more about it. So it's like what teachers in school try to do by trying to make learning fun for their kids, but you're teaching them a bunch of stuff that they don't care about. So that's why it's hard for kids in public schools to care about their education. But this article kind of goes on. It talks about the whole idea of socializing your students, socializing your kids, and he goes into a quote from Diane Flynn Keith, who is the author of the book Car Schooling. And she says, quote, "I hate to be the one to break it to you, but there's nothing normal about our kids." Those are homeschool kids. "Your homeschool child is odd compared to the normal schooled population because they have not experienced the ongoing school-based socialization and standardization. They haven't been indoctrinated in the same way. They have not been steeped in the popular consumer culture to the degree that most schooled children have, or schooled kids have been. They're not adult phobic or peer dependent." And those are a couple of things that in that quote, obviously it's very, those are some, it sounds like a book that's very homeschool focused, but the thing I thought was interesting about it were the lines that your kids haven't been socialized and standardized. The standardized part jumped out at me, as well as the idea of them being peer dependent, which I think is really an interesting concept on that point too. I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add on that point, Chris, but I just think the idea of kids being dependent on one another, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's a normal sort of when you're not comfortable in your own skin, or you're learning to be comfortable in your own skin, it's normal to want to be part of a group that sort of thinks and likes things the same way that you do. That's completely natural, because we all want to feel validated. And I think that's part of what public school sort of feeds into, and not intentionally, but when you're in public school, if you're thinking and acting and feeling like the rest of the kids, or the majority of the kids there, then you're sort of part of that collective, and you can it makes you feel more comfortable because, hey, gosh darn it, people like me, my friends like me. And I think what that does is it's not entirely a negative thing, but I do think that there are some negative aspects to that. and I don't know if this is where you were going with things, but I'm just sort of picking up on the adult phobic and peer dependent aspect of what you said. And I think um, what happens is that when people think differently, like what this article is saying, is they're regarded as odd. So when someone doesn't think the same way that I do, and I guess I should rephrase that. When someone doesn't think the same way as the majority does, then they're regarded as odd. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we need people that think outside of the box. We need people that aren't dependent on, trying to think the same way that everybody else is, because it's what makes them feel comfortable. And I think that's really where true leadership, true individuality is created. So when you see the people like the Albert Einsteins and the even so we got famous inventors, famous scientists, even famous artists, famous politicians. If you look back into some of their backgrounds, they were those type of kids. I'm not saying that everybody that's super smart has that type of a background where they're just so different than everybody else. That's not true. But what I am saying is that people who think differently are usually able to sort of pave new ground and create sort of a niche, if you will, for themselves. And it's odd because as we grow up, so when we're in the school state, like in the schooling stage, high school, middle school, and whatnot, we all want to think the same. But as we become adults, we actually start to appreciate and respect people who think differently than us and who have a different perspective, because we're sort of looking up to them like, oh wow, that person has a really fantastic perspective on this given subject, and I'd really like to learn more about it. And they seem like they're an authority in that. So people who have different perspectives, the value goes up astronomically as you enter the workforce and into the later stages of life. So I would tend to agree with this article. I think the gist of the article, not entirely sure where you're going with it, but I feel like it's got a positive light. It's sort of shining a positive light on homeschooling. And although I don't necessarily think homeschooling is the only way to achieve that type of different thinking, I do think it does help.
No, I don't think it is either. I mean, there's, for instance, when I was in high school, I think I mentioned the stories before about kind of getting in trouble at times in high school because I asked too many questions, getting kicked out of a class for questioning what the teacher was saying. And
How dare you?
I know, right? Thought criminal here. But it was one of those times when, I think it has to do mostly with, I think it has to do with partially the personality of the child. Someone who's very compliant may not necessarily want to think outside the box or think for themselves, and maybe they do, but they don't, express it that way. But also it has to do, I think, partially with the friends that you hang out with, because people do want to fit in, and even if you're in a public school situation, like I was never the popular kid in school. Surprise, surprise, right? And so we had a lot of my friends that I hung out with. We tended to be kind of the oddballs, the outcasts, or whatever you want to call us. And I had friends who were popular kids too. I tried to kind of be friendly with just about everybody. But one of my best friends in my last couple of years of high school, he's one of the main influences that actually kind of led me towards the libertarian path. But we would oftentimes go through and we'd look at different topics and we'd go through our research papers and stuff and always find little things to kind of nitpick about and pick apart and dissect and stuff like that. So yeah, it's not one of those things where it's like, oh, this is homeschool is the only way. It's the only way you're going to have free thinking kids. I don't think that at all. But I think it does bring up some interesting points about the nature. Because I feel like as adults we value the independence of free thinking individuals. We look at people like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak for what they did with Apple, and which granted Steve Jobs did kind of rip Xerox off, but that's another story altogether. But those two guys together, they transformed the world. Really, if you think about it, starting with the original Apple designs and stuff, and look where we're at now. As obnoxious as Apple can be sometimes, they did a lot of good for driving the industry forward. So now we're looking at things like USB-C becoming the next standard thing that's going to be everywhere, which is great. Even though it's really annoying that the new ones only have like 4 ports on them. Go ahead. You want to say something?
Well, first I'll just agree with your very last statement right there. The USB-C, and they only have 4 ports. At work, we have a lot of people using those same computers, and they're regularly frustrated by that. But isn't it interesting to note how Apple has changed since Steve Jobs passed? Because you're referring to him and Steve Wozniak as sort of like these pioneers who, granted, he may have gotten some of his ideas for Xerox, where he sort of got his first like entry position into the that whole arena. But he began that. I mean, we can't even count on one hand the number of innovations that he made both in software and in hardware, that sort of pushed the home computing industry to where it is now. But look at where Apple is now. Under it took a few years for that to sort of catch up, because you have the sort of the creative mill of like the projects that are going to be released forthcoming.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people say that the iPhone 5S was the very last phone that Steve Jobs was really involved in, and you could see the difference in even in the design and the functionality of that phone between the newer phones, which got bigger, they got uglier, and that's just from an aesthetic standpoint. But looking at the company Apple itself, the company with Steve Jobs made its mark on the industry by being different and sort of presenting things in a different way. And now that they've sort of be almost, it's like they've become the emperor, basically, in a way. They've become what they so hated in companies like Microsoft, who are just like, I mean, Apple is constantly, I own all Apple devices. So I know Apple is constantly having software and hardware problems all over the place now, and it was never like that before. There's all these bugs. They're releasing all these like really quick patches, and then the patches are fixed. And stop me if this doesn't sound familiar to another company that used to do the same exact stuff. Microsoft. So it's. I think that the reason I'm bringing that up is to sort of, I guess, illustrate the point that we're both, I think, trying to make, which is like the innovation that these men had and the difference that they made in the marketplace. And then when you throw something in there and just say, okay, this is what's working for us, we're just going to keep doing that. We're going to stop innovating and just go with the flow. You see what happens. You get stuff that's messed up. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the advantage of thinking differently and pushing boundaries is great. And sure, you're going to fail a lot. Steve Jobs, all these pioneers failed in so many respects, but it's the successes that we remember. We remember Steve Jobs as being this great man. Since his passing, we remember him as being this great man who was such a great orator, and he could just talk to you about any subject, and you were just like instantly engrossed in it. He had these amazing gifts, but he wasn't necessarily like this gifted student in school. He wasn't going to and I think there was a similar case maybe with Bill Gates too, where he didn't even finish his college career, things like that. So I guess to bring it back home, we don't want to fit into molds, because what happens is when we try to fit into molds, we end up, just fitting into the mold and being like everybody else, and nobody stands out. Everybody's the same. And you get just bland, blah, blah, blah. You get Toyota, you get, Honda cars, you get these cars that it's just it is what it is. It's very bland, but it gets the job done. But everybody has one. And now Apple's like that too. Everybody has one. It's just blah. So I think it's very great, a sign of a greatness to be able to stand out and not be afraid of being different and sounding different and looking different and thinking different, just in every respect of your life.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think, and I don't mind sticking with the tech stuff if you want to keep talking about that. I think that I don't know, I've noticed that with Apple. I've never really been a huge Apple guy. I'm starting to appreciate it a bit more now. Granted, I haven't used the newer MacBooks. I know I watched reviews on them and stuff. The port thing annoys me because IT stuff. I need ports. I know it's really annoying. So what I'm thinking about is I was looking at getting a new computer, and I was looking at a Mac because I was like, I want to be able to do more stuff for our show, for the podcast and stuff, and I feel like a Mac would just make it easier. Looking at the new ones, I'm like, I can't do anything with that. I'm not going to spend $300 on new, accessories and dongles and hubs and stuff. There's no reason for that. So, I'm looking back at like the 2015 models or something like that, which might work better. I'm actually on this show. I'm actually using a 2009 MacBook, one's a little old like plastic white ones, the unibody ones.
Those are
Um,
fantastic.
oh
Those are
yeah,
just, they're slow by today's standard. But they're just fantastic.
it's not that bad. I mean, if coming from what I'm used to using, it's really not that bad. It's Yeah, it's got a Core 2 Duo processor in it. It's got I think 5 gigabytes of RAM because someone loaded in the wrong numbers of RAM sticks in there. But it's fine. It's a little slow, but it's not anything that I'm not used to because I run old computers all the time because I don't feel like buying new ones. But I
But
mean,
see, the
Garage.
thing about those computers is they just work, and that's sort of to quote a phrase that I think maybe Steve Jobs coined. It just works.
Hmm.
But that's not what Apple is anymore. It doesn't just work because, like you just expressed, you have to have all these dongles and adapters and all that stuff. Even for my iPhone that no longer has a headphone jack, there's times when I'm stuck down, stuck up river without a raft because, I can't, I don't have the right adapter. I don't have the right headphone, and I wanted to use it on my computer, and it's just maddeningly frustrating that it doesn't just work. You know,
Yeah, maybe in like 10 years when USB-C is the standard for everybody, then it'll be great. But I mean, even looking at the specs of the new MacBooks, it's all the same. I mean, it's the same stuff that was in the previous MacBook. It's just slightly updated. It's nothing new, nothing really innovative like you were talking about. I remember being in my freshman year of college in '05, and the guy across the hall was everyone was like super jealous because he had the first generation iPod, and we all thought that was the coolest thing ever. And then like I think it was like 2 3 years later, my wife for Christmas got me an iPod Classic, which I think was like the fifth or sixth generation one, and that one was great. I love that thing. I wish it still worked. But I can't buy anymore. I can't. I wanted to get another one because it was like 160 gigabyte hard drive, so I could fit all my music on there, plus my backups and stuff like that. And it had a full color HD LED screen, and but yeah, I dropped it one too many times and the hard drives got jacked up. But I can't buy a new one because they don't make them anymore. Everything's just the iPod Touch, which is basically a regurgitation of the iPhone without the cellular functionality, and so I find that super frustrating. But I mean, you
but
compare that though. You mentioned Microsoft, and it's funny looking at Microsoft because they're actually innovating a lot. I've been kind of a critic of Microsoft since Vista, I think. 7 was okay. I thought it was the best thing since XP, but um, everyone craps all over Windows 10. But honestly, it's not that bad. The thing I didn't like was the auto updating features on it, and that really bothered me because it kind of took that control away from the user. But if you know what you're doing or you know how to look it up on the internet, you can easily fix that problem. But I mean, they're innovating left and right. This new guy who's in charge of it, Satya Nadella, he knows what he's doing, man. He's innovating a lot of open sourcing. He's open sourcing a lot of Microsoft projects and stuff. Um, like they got the Linux subsystem for or the Windows subsystem for Linux now, so you can like for people like me who prefer using a Unix based software like Linux or Mac. Um, if I had to do some sort of work on a Windows machine, I could use Ubuntu Linux or Debian or Fedora or something like that and be perfectly content with Windows now. Sorry, I kind of went on a tangent there. You go ahead with what you want to say.
well, you were talking about iPods and having the friend down the hall who had that iPod, and then you got one a couple of years later, and I still have my iPod. I think it was like the fifth generation. The sixth generation was the last generation iPod. And I picked one of those up, the fifth gen, for like $50. But you can't use it anymore unless you own your music. So in other words, unless you have CDs that you ripped music from and put it on your computer and keep it there, and then put it on, plug your iPod in to your computer, you literally cannot put music on there. I remember because I got into this iTunes Match thing, or iTunes Match, Apple Music thing, where you basically pay a monthly fee, which is about the price of an album, to be able to listen to any music all the time, anytime you want, and you can still download it onto your devices. But guess what? It doesn't work with any type of device that doesn't connect to the internet. So if you're an owner of an old iPod, you're screwed. You can't use it. It's useless. It's a worthless piece of metal just taking up space now. And I put it in one of my storage compartments, even though I love it. and would love to use it. I just don't have all of the music anymore. I lost it over the periods of time when I realized, computer breaks down or whatever, and you lose stuff and whatnot. But and also to illustrate it, to talk another point you made about your MacBook having 5 gigs of RAM, you can't switch out your RAM anymore in the new MacBooks,
Really?
the laptops. You can't even switch your RAM out in an iMac, the new iMacs. You can't do anything to those short of I think, even in the new ones, I don't even think you can switch out your hard drive anymore without everything is soldered into the motherboard. Period.
It's ridiculous.
So yeah, that was one of the things that I loved, because I think I had like several generations of MacBook, the MacBook Pro. I think I had a 17-inch one, the big one the biggest one you could get when I was in college. I ended up getting another one after that from like 2009, and I think I got a 2011. And all of those, I took them and I swapped out my RAM so I could get more RAM, because guess what? I didn't want to pay the astronomical amount that Apple was charging at the time. A couple years down the road, the RAM gets cheaper. You buy some and you unscrew the back of it, you throw the stuff in there, the RAM in there, and you're good. You swap it out. The new ones, you can't do that. Not only do you not have more than 4 ports that are the same thing, you can't switch out your RAM. You can't switch out your hard drive, even if it's an SSD on a chip. What else? I think I did a processor swap one time on one of my MacBooks, and it was fantastic. You won't get anywhere near that anymore, so that's really disappointing. So Apple's just moved in the direction of that planned obsolescence that we hear so frequently, which just basically just means that companies are planning for the products that they sell you today to be obsolete within a few years, so that you're basically forced to buy a new one, the latest version, when it's not really working, it's slowing down. And speaking of slowing down, we've got the whole debacle of Apple devices slowing down, where they basically got caught red-handed, caught with their pants down, whatever you want to call it, with these battery issues. And they basically said, gave a load of horse manure and told people that, oh, well, devices with older batteries have to be slowed down in the software, because the battery just can't take the strain of the full power of the system. So what they're telling you is, we purposely slow your device down, and it's because of your battery, which should last at least a year or two. But we have people who bought devices a year and a half ago, who are experiencing it slowing down. My wife has an iPhone 6S, which is like a year and a half, no, 2 years old maybe at the most, and it just slows down. But yet the processor was state of the art 2 years ago.
Well, I'm still running this.
And like you're saying, processors, the technology hasn't changed that much, right? I mean, we have the difference between, and you can go on the internet and look up an article, you name it, from like Tech Radar or wherever. The comparison between a 6th generation Intel processor and an 8th generation Intel processor of the same tier is almost nothing performance-wise. There might be like a 10 to 15% bump, but it's got, especially since they haven't increased the number of transistors. I think they're still at 14 nanometer technology. They're still trying to get to the 10 nanometer, which I'm sure we'll see a bit of a bump at some point once they get into that next generation. But there's no difference. So why does a 2-year-old phone have performance drops when there's no real, discernible difference between the generations of the chips? It's just mind-boggling.
Yeah. No, it's stupid. Like I was showing you, I'm still rocking an iPhone 4S because, like I said, I just use stuff until it runs out. But yeah, this thing was. I mean, what year did the 4S come out? Was it like 2011? Is that when it came out? Something like that?
That's a good question. I would say probably 2010, 2011.
Well, let's look it up. Let's see. iPhone 4S.
But that, to be honest with you, the iPhone 4S and the iPhone 5 and 5S were my favorite iPhone designs. They were just solid. They were, had those nice edges, very well designed. The camera didn't stick out the back. And I always loved that because at the time, the Galaxy, the Samsung Galaxy, the LG devices all had these cameras, stupid cameras that stuck out the back, and it was all plasticky looking, and you couldn't set your. I would laugh at them because I'm like, oh, they can't set their phone down even on a flat surface. It's just going to rock around. And guess what? The iPhone 6 came out, and it had this camera that sticks out, and it even worse than the camera being in the middle. It's off to one side, so anytime you set it down without a case, it's just gonna rock around and
Yeah, no, I mean this thing has been running fine until this most recent. They forced an update onto it, and same thing. Now it slows down. It's slower than it ever has been, and when it hits like between anywhere between 20% and 6%, it just shuts off. And like, you got 20% left. Why are you shutting my phone off? It's so frustrating. So like anytime that I'm out and I don't have my charger with me, then it's gone. So I've got this thing until it runs out. Then I got a 5C to take its place afterwards, but I got to switch providers because it's like a GSM, so I can't use it on Verizon, which is also stupid. But
and to be honest with you, battery problems on an iPhone, what, a 6 or 7 year old iPhone 4? You said 2012?
2011, I was right.
2011. So we were right. So 2011. So you got a 7 year old phone. Yeah, it's gonna have battery problems, I would assume. That's perfectly understandable. But not on a 2 year old device, not even maybe a 3 year old device. You could expect to start seeing things like that happen. But we're finding out that the batteries were manufactured so cheaply. And again, guys, just look this up. Go do a simple Google search. The batteries were manufactured on such a cheap process that they're degrading quicker than they should have been. And Apple's basically come out and admitted this. They're like, oh yeah, well, if you want, you can come in and get a battery replacement for da-da-da-da price. So they're not even going to do it for free. It's something that should be lasting the entire life of the phone, at least 2 years, until your contract runs out and you get another phone and afford to put down the payments on it, because nobody can afford to put down $1,000. Very few people can afford to put down that $1,000 cash to buy the phone outright. So, they've got us between a rock and a hard place, and it's kind of disappointing to see, from a company that's, I thought, to be as reputable as Apple. I've always looked at Apple for the longest time as being, yes, this reputable company. They manufacture things that are the highest quality. They don't cut corners. They don't try to hide things like some of these other companies. They build solid devices, things like that. And now it's come to that. And not only do we have hardware problems, but we've got software problems galore. I mean, the updates just for iOS alone for the mobile devices is just insane. And they keep saying, oh, it's going to fix this. And then you read an article based on the drop, the latest iOS update, and it's like, oh, this breaks now. You can't text this particular character or else it'll shut your phone off. And it's just a nightmare. Apple needs to simplify and go back to what was working for them before, where you had one device, one screen size. You weren't trying to like make every single person happy. You were just making a really great product that was solid, with very few updates that worked.
Yeah, that's how it should be. On the topic of like phones and stuff like that, I got something to show you, and you're gonna like it because I got super excited when I heard about it. Now, you guys all know that I am a big Linux open source nerd, so I wanted to show this to everybody, and just let you all have a look at it. This is the Librem 5 from a company called Purism, and Purism is a Linux hardware software manufacturer, and they release a line of laptops that are kind of unique because they're built to run Linux, so they kind of are more stable in that way when it comes to hardware compatibility with the Linux kernel. But they wanted to put out a phone, and so they were crowdsourcing it, and there's a lot of debate about whether or not it was going to actually get funded. They actually managed to get, I think, 156% of their crowdsourcing or crowdfunding goal. And so this is a kind of a mock-up of what it's going to look like when it's ready. So it's a pretty slick-looking phone, I think. And I mean, it doesn't have like the the huge screens that like the new iPhones have, but I'm not sure exactly what the dimensions are going to be. But I intend on getting one of these at some point whenever they have them actually finished being manufactured and everything. But it actually runs a mobile version of Linux, and so it's more, it's not Android, it's not iOS, it's a different infrastructure completely. But their focus is primarily on privacy and the user having ownership over their device. So no longer are you tied into the Apple ecosystem or the Android ecosystem, which is dependent on Google or dependent on the device manufacturer like Samsung or LG or something like that. But the other cool thing about it, I don't know if you can see them on the side here. There's little buttons here, and some of those are going to be like volume rockers and stuff like that. But they actually are going to have physical kill switches for the camera and the microphones. So that way, for people who are paranoid that maybe they're being spied on by their phones, you can actually just physically disable the camera and the audio device, which I think is pretty sweet.
That is really cool, and I like the idea of the privacy and sort of the open sourceness of the operating system, and of course Linux is very, very awesome and very stable. I honestly would probably be using it if it wasn't so uncommon, I guess, in the industry I work in. It's just so difficult to use. It would be difficult to have the proper software for every program that I need and be able to work with, I guess, other people who are using the platforms. It's kind of like almost the same situation that Apple users experienced, 15, 20 years ago, where it's like very difficult to share things, but or work together. But I'm assuming they're probably working around that stuff very well. So I don't want to hold it to that standard.
We're making great progress, great success.
Yeah. I think very great progress. But since you brought up security, I just want to bring up something else. And I'm a huge Apple user, and I have always been an Apple fan, borderline Apple fanboy, I would say. And I'm sorry for those of you who really like Apple, and I'm not trying to bash them continuously on this episode on purpose, but this just sort of keeps coming up because they're doing these things. But I do want to bring up an article. This is out of Wired, and I'm pretty sure most of our viewers would know that Apple has moved its iCloud data to China.
Oh,
so, yay! So they, Apple moved their iCloud data to China, and also the encryption keys. So I don't know for anybody who's watched Apple keynotes, and the security comes up. They would talk about encryption keys and all those fancy phrases for identity protection as being like that's the only way to get to your information. Blah blah blah. Well, they're actually in moving to China because China is giving them such a great 0% tax deal on this. So zero taxes for Apple because they're moving this part of their business to China. Well, China is going to have access, legally have access to all that stuff, and basically can force Apple to give them information if they need to, because that's how China works. They're a communist country. Who knew, right? So it boggles my mind to think. I'm trying to understand. I think maybe from a business perspective, Apple's really, really, really trying to gain a strong foothold in China. So they're like, okay, let's go ahead and get this. We'll sacrifice our ideals here so we can continue to get a stronger foothold in China, because guess what that translates to? More money for us, because China has billions of people that, if we can get them iPhones into their hands, that's more money for us. And gosh, I'm not trying to bash Apple, but that's just sort of, this is in the news. This is what Apple's doing. This is the moves that they're making publicly that we can all see. It's out there naked for everybody to see. And it's just honestly quite disturbing. I don't know. What's your take on that? Apple moving to China?
I don't like that. I don't like that they're storing. Why do they have to store all their data in China? I don't understand that. With the technology available, why would they need to do that? Does the article say anything about that?
I haven't really read this article through, but one thing that is a problem is Chinese law. I mean, is obviously going to be quite different from American law. So we've had very public cases and heated debates about privacy. It was a couple of years ago with the San Bernardino shooter. Basically, he had an iPhone, and the FBI was trying to get the information off the iPhone for this guy who went on a rampage, and Apple was basically like, sorry, we don't have the encryption key, so our hands are totally tied. We can't help you out with that. But guess what? Like, we found out after the fact that Apple does have ability to unlock that type of stuff. Apple did, of course, build that in backdoors because what smart company wouldn't? Um, the problem is that that they want to keep their public face to appear to be, I guess, in the people's favor. I think, but more and more of these moves that they're making are really betraying sort of their lack of concern for the consumer and total concern for their bottom line.
That doesn't make any sense. I don't. And I just think it's stupid. Like as far as the San Bernardino guy, I don't. I still don't understand why the cops didn't just stick the dead guy's thumb on his phone to unlock it. That I mean, most people who have that ability are using it, even though I personally wouldn't. You know, like the police have the authority to be able to use. They can compel you to give your fingerprints when you get booked, or if you go somewhere else. They have. I'm pretty sure this has gone through like the Court of Appeals and everything too. They've decided that it's the police have a constitutional right, or the Federal Bureau of Investigation, whoever, they have a constitutional right to be able to compel you to give your fingerprint as part of the booking process, but they don't have the right to force you to give your PIN. And so you shoot the guy, he's dead, you take his thumb, you stick it on his phone, it's unlocked, and you just don't let it lock itself back. Because iPhones, I think they automatically like lock it, and you have to put in a PIN after like 72 hours or something like that.
You can change settings so that it never locks once you're in, but I think you would, yeah. And again, if you had the fingerprint, you could just keep doing that.
Right.
But I don't know that the fingerprint was implemented at the point of that event. So I could be wrong. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But
right. I mean, that's really neither here nor there. I was just a thought. But the idea of China being in control of that bothers me because I feel like there's a lot of places in the world where you can store that data, especially with virtual servers and the way that the internet's set up and the way that, you know, like for instance, I could spin us up a VPS on a service like DigitalOcean, for example, and I could set us up a Linux server that hosts all of our files, and we could do everything through there. I don't do that because it's a lot of work and I don't have the time or the energy to do it, and it costs money. So patreon.com/2wiseguys if you want to help out. But the thing is I can set that virtual server to be coming out of anywhere. I can set it to come out of Russia. I can set it to come out of China. It could be coming out of New York. It could be coming out of San Francisco. It could be coming out of Switzerland. It doesn't matter. You can pick where. So why? I don't understand why that data has to be stored in a country that most people, for no other reason, like a lot of people just don't trust them. Their government, rather, not the Chinese people, but the government over there.
Well, I don't even know the title of the guy who's running the country, but he set himself up permanently as essentially a dictator just a week ago. They voted for it. He's never leaving.
It's hard to say they voted for it when there's only one candidate on the ballot.
Well, there's others, and there's political sort of parties, I guess, but I don't know if it's like a vote or what, but he set himself up as, essentially like he's the guy now, forever, as long as he's alive.
Mm-hmm. Mussolini had elections too. Just saying. And anyways,
socialism.
Yeah.
Never works. It never works yet. I don't understand why there's even a conversation going about that. But
I also kind of wonder how many people in China can afford a phone that costs 8,388 yen or yuan. Excuse me. It just makes me wonder. Because anyways, that's how much the iPhone is going to cost in China.
That's a lot of yuan.
It's a lot of yuan. I mean, it's $1,000 here. It's a lot of dollars too. But I don't know. Now we have this conversation. Now I'm not even sure if I want a Mac anymore. I don't know. I like it. I think it's a fun system to use. It's got all these. I like Pages. I think Pages is a cool little. It makes nice looking documents. It's not as functional as I would like. It's not as functional as like Microsoft Word or LibreOffice, but it looks nice.
Dude, I haven't even seen Microsoft Word, and I can't even tell you how long.
Yeah, it's not. I'm not really a fan of it. There's too many new bells and whistles they try to put in that just slow everything down. I've been using LibreOffice for the longest time because that's what we have on Linux. But you should check it out sometime. You can go on do like an online version of it. It works okay.
You know what I use at work, or what is Google Docs, to be honest with you. because our work accounts, our work emails are set up on Google, even though it's like under our own um, company domain name. So everything is Google Docs. You got Google Slides, you got Google Docs, you got Google spreadsheets. It's cool. I like it. I mean, they work. They work. They're not slow. It might be web based, but you can access your information anytime from a web browser, as long as you have your login. So I do like that aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you one thing. I'm not a huge fan of Google Docs, mostly because I'm not a huge fan of Google either. But I do like their slides. I think is what they call it, their PowerPoint equivalent. Um, they make some good looking presentations. I've made a couple of them over the years, and they look really good. Um, but no, I mean, I keep going back to it, and the reason why I like Linux is because it puts the user in control of these things, and they're making such strides now with um, with software compatibility and there's no vendor lock-in, so um, it's not like you have to worry about having to stick with one particular part of the ecosystem in order to use it. Um, like for instance, I've been using Ubuntu for like the last 7 years, off and on, or its derivatives. There's Linux is complicated. Maybe it's worth a discussion some other time when it's not quite as excuse me, where it's not quite as random of a discussion as we're having now. But um, I'm able to put in what I want to share. Like when you go, I'm trying to think of how to describe it. Like when you're using Windows or you're using Apple, it reports back to Microsoft, or it reports back to Apple what where your location is, for instance. Um, with Linux, they're just now starting to decide whether or not they want to do that, and they're leaning to. I think in the next release of Ubuntu and a few other versions, I think maybe Fedora, they're going to start doing that. No, not Fedora. I'm sorry, it's Elementary OS. But anyways, they're leaving it at the country level. Like they don't want to know your IP address. They don't want to know what state you're in. They don't want to know what city you're in. They just want to know what country are you in. So if you're in an English speaking country, we should probably do more development for English speaking language sets. If you're in France, we should probably do some more development for French people. Things like that. But I don't know. I just feel like it offers more freedom of you to be able to use the system the way you want it to be used without it tracking all of your data, without tracking all of your progress. Because I remember reading an article or a book a few years back, even talking about Microsoft Office and how if your system is connected to a network, if it's connected to the internet, part of the usage data that gets sent back to Microsoft is how you're using Microsoft Word. So it's taking what you're writing and it's sending it back to Microsoft. Not the entirety of what you're writing, but it takes snippets of what you're writing and sends it back to Microsoft. I don't know if they're still doing that. I feel like they're probably moving away from that. But I don't know. I just feel like it's one of those things. And the nice thing is that now we're starting to see more and more companies developing for, especially things like Ubuntu Linux, which is kind of the big one. It's one that most people use. And so, like we're seeing, like we have Steam on Linux now, which is great. So you can't necessarily get like the highest end games per se, but there's a lot of games being ported to the Linux version of Steam. So we're able to sit on there and play. I don't know. I don't play a lot of games anymore, but you could go on there. I could go on there and play the Knights of the Old Republic on my Linux box, no problem, which is great. Anyways, I'm on another tangent. Go ahead.
Well, to piggyback off what you were saying just a few minutes ago about was it sharing the user's location? Was that what you were saying?
Yeah,
I think so. Every time I use an app on my phone, every time I download a software update on my phone or my computer, there's always like those little check boxes, right? It's like, do you want to share your information, blah blah blah, for purposes of what is it, for like what's it called, for the purposes of like for the company to be able to like diagnostic type stuff. Is that, am I saying that right?
Yeah, something like that.
Okay, well anyway, I'm probably not giving the full name right, but I every time I see those, I'm like, should I click it? Should I click it? Like, I don't know. Are they going to be watching me? Is there something in this like NDA, or is there something in this agreement that like is like saying like, hey, we can track you anytime, anywhere? And that thought goes through my mind. And Am I saying that that thought is right? No, I'm not saying that, but that thought does go through my mind now, just because of all of the news that we've seen, all of the proven news that we've seen. Not just, this isn't just rumors, where we had Google in 2013 doing stuff like this and whatnot, tracking users, keeping users' information, and guess what? We have an entire NSA facility in Utah, 11 acres, that does nothing but dragnet people's information and uh, conversations and transactions and everything like that. So this, and we know about this because of WikiLeaks. We know about this because of whistleblowers. So, and the media, despite the media's best efforts to keep this stuff under wraps and label these people kooks and etc., the proof is in the pudding. So for me, the disturbing thing about it is, great, Linux is, a company like Linux, or operating system like Linux, I should say, is like still sort of like trying to see, should we do this or not? The problem I see is that in order to stay with the times, to continue to perform at peak levels, and be abreast of the best technology and information that we all want to have access to, that we become accustomed to having access to at our fingertips, we're going to have to do that stuff. We're going to have to say yes to that stuff. And it's getting, even, I remember when I first would see those things, I would be a little leery of it. And then, they sort of like convince you like, okay, everything's going to be fine. Don't worry. We're not tracking. We're not saving any data, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. Let me click this and I won't worry about it. And then you find out later Uber was doing the same thing and tracking you, while the app's off, and figuring out where you're at, so they can, all for their own purposes. So I'm just past. I'm past all of this with these companies, lying to us. I don't trust any of those agreements. I mean, if I don't have time to read through all those agreements. I just assume the worst when I see those agreements now, and I think that's a fair assumption to have. It's understandable given all of the information that's come out. But I really do think that this is where the future is. And as much as I hate to say it, that's just, integration is the future. And the only way you can get more integrated is to have more information, to share more information between programs, between devices, between the Internet of Things. The more information is shared, the more sort of like data and metadata that gets shared. That's the only way things get more integrated and get smarter, and you get refrigerators that figure out when they're going to die and tell you how to, you got to fix something or change the temperature and all that stuff, is because of the root of what I'm talking about right now, and what you're talking about with the security measures and opting into sharing your location. And to make all that possible, you have to opt in. So that's why I'm saying it's the future, because we don't, as a society, and it's kind of bringing it a little bit full circle back to the homeschooling thing, where you want to be part of the group, you want to go with the flow and be part of the norm. This is what we've become accustomed to. We've essentially been trained into this type of a lifestyle by the very devices and the very products that we're buying and paying for. The iPhones, the Galaxies, the computers that have only one port that you have to get all these adapters for and sign all these agreements for every time you download a software update. We're being trained for that stuff. Not necessarily like with a trainer with a whip and hey, go ahead and stand up and do this trick for me type of thing. But it's like when you feed an animal, like a dog, you put the food in their dish, and they come to expect the food to be in their dish at a certain time in a certain place, because that's when the food shows up. And that's sort of like what's being done here. We're getting the food in our dish. We're getting all the information provided for us by these companies, by Google and the searches, and everything's more effective. And now, like I said, the only thing that's making that possible is us basically giving up our privacy. Okay, we got to give up our privacy if we want that stuff. And we do want that stuff. So I guess we got to give up our privacy. And if we don't, and this will be the last thing I say right here, but if we don't give up our privacy, then we get left behind. We get left behind at work. We get left behind at school. And I think that we're not very far away from this. I think our kids are going to be putting up with this type of stuff, in school and in the workplace, where you have to have immediate access to this information, you have to have the latest technology to be able to stay abreast of everything because it's moving so quickly. And if you want to keep your job or you want to get a job in a particular field, you're going to have to do that. You're going to have to sacrifice your privacy, or you're just not going to be you're not going to be able to get hired. You're not going to be able to work. You're not going to be able to make money. And that's just fantastic. I think that's just fantastic that we have to give up our privacy for that. I'm being sarcastic.
I couldn't tell. I couldn't tell at all. No, I agree, and I mean that's why I use Linux. And I know it sounds weird. It sounds like I'm preaching, and it really isn't. But it's more of like I grew up in the Windows ecosystem, so I grew up being used to Microsoft. I got introduced to my first computer I ever used was like, I don't even know what it was, it was like an Amiga or something, one of those old green and black screen text only command line systems. It was at my grandma's house, so back in the early 90s, imagine. Okay. And then my mom came home with a Hewlett Packard desktop PC running Windows 95 and had a little disk for America Online with their 56K modem, and it was a glorious day. And we always had Windows. I had Windows, and I didn't really realize how weird I guess I was, because I grew up on the internet. I grew up connected to computers and new technologies, and while I may not have always had the latest, newest technology, like I didn't think so at the time, because we didn't have the thing that just came out like 2 days ago. It wasn't until I married your sister that I realized how advanced our family was when it came to having technology in the house and stuff. Like, my mom bought a PC in '95 when Windows 95 came out. We were on America Online like when it first was becoming a thing, like before it was everywhere. I remember hanging out with my stepdad at the time, when I think I was like 10 or 11, and we'd be connected in the house playing Command and Conquer over a LAN. I didn't know. I realized I didn't have any other friends who did that stuff. But I had a laptop that was given to me by the school I went to up near Chicago. It was running Windows 98, and man, that thing was heavy. It was like 20 pounds, I swear. It was so heavy, and I had to walk to school with that thing on. It was so heavy, and I was a fat kid. I hated exercise, and so it was miserable. But I played with that thing all the time, and anyways, long story short, I ended up staying on Windows until 2010, and I discovered Linux and I started using it, and it's the greatest thing. It's fast. I remember originally putting it on a laptop running. It was a Windows XP laptop that I had, and it was slow. It took like 10 minutes to boot up because it was just so run down and slow with all the stuff from Windows and everything. And I put Ubuntu Linux on there, and it booted up in like 30 seconds. It was great, which sounds like a long time now, in 2018. But anyways, it's just interesting seeing the way things are going now and understanding the things that Microsoft does and seeing what Apple's doing with moving their servers and everything over to China, and the way that they're monitoring things and the way that they're working with the FBI and the CIA and the NSA or whoever it is that they're working with now. And you mentioned the keys, that they have the encryption keys. I would assume that those are public keys that they're bringing over there, because they should not have access to your private key if you're doing encryption. That should be stored locally on your device. But if they are taking that and having that handy, that's not good either. And if they're able to crack that 128-bit encryption or whatever they're using based on just their public key, that's not secure at all, and that's a concern as well. So I'd rather continue using something like Linux, where I'm able to to encrypt my own stuff. And I think would be fun, and we can talk about this later, but I think it might be fun for next week episode, or next I went southern there, I went real southern there, for maybe next week's episode, for us to do a show dedicated to things that we can do to de-Googlefy your life or something. It's a bad name for it because it's not just talking about Google, but just how to be more secure online and with your things like that. Because I think you're right as far as this whole idea of we have to conform to what these manufacturers are saying. We have to opt into being tracked. We have to opt into giving up our privacy and our own personal security with these things for our data, in order to be a part of the system that has been established. And I don't necessarily think it's a good system. I feel like it's one that compromises too much. That's why we have things like Equifax, where we're not even given the option to opt into that. We're just included in it because that's how the system runs. And now all of our data is out there for what, like 300 million people? That's the entire population of the United States of America, and or a little bit less. And like, is my 9, 7, and 5 year old kids' data part of that breach? Is that out there now so that people can sell that to, on the dark web or something like that? That's what I would wonder. And they didn't have an opportunity to opt into that. We didn't have an opportunity to opt out of it either. There's no way to opt out of it. So I think maybe it would be good to kind of take some time and maybe next week go through that. It could be our own personal little PSA or something like that about how to reclaim your privacy, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and I think that'd be a great thing to do. I think a lot of viewers would probably enjoy that. I know I would, because that's always something that's at the back of my mind, and is reclaiming privacy. And there's sort of like this I guess yearning almost to get back to a simpler way of life, and bring things to, bring just sort of like the intensity of life down. There's just so much that's going on these days, and it's there. We're just constantly bombarded by information from all sides, and it's only going to intensify. It's only going to continue to grow, the amount of information, as we continue to see society push more towards a greater integration of lifestyle with technology. And I think that I've become convinced that the only real way to regain true privacy, not like complete fully get that privacy back, is to basically go off grid, to leave essentially life as we know it. And I think, speaking of opting in, like you're saying about the Equifax, with social security numbers, and credit report type of things, which we'd never opt into, because we're just sort of like, we're born into that. Because guess what? You get a social security number when you're born. So you're born into that. It's not a choice. It is a fact. And I think that's, yeah, social security is, I guess, a good thing, of course, because it's a social net. But I feel like we're being herded like cattle. Society in general is being herded like cattle out of the fields, to sort of use a metaphor, out of the plains into the barn, I guess, or the cities and the technology. The barn representing city and technology, the field representing nature, and sort of like just being, simpler things. And that, because if you look, okay, even the people who from a vocational standpoint have chosen or grown up in chosen to be farmers, or grew up in a family that was a farmer, for example, a farming family, for example, they're being pushed out of that now. I mean, that's been taken over. That's long since been taken over by large companies like the Monsantos and everything. And they basically own, they figured out a way so that they could own the farmers. Go watch. There's some very interesting documentaries on Monsanto and farmers, by the way, if you guys ever get a chance to watch them. It's very, very eye-opening. And it's very sad at the same time, because these, farmers who are, making a living being farmers, are having essentially their rights to their very own seeds taken away from them. So I guess, in 1 second, I just want to make this point. I guess what I'm trying to say is, so that the farmers are getting pushed out of this too, because they can no longer make money. They can no longer be profitable. They can't even live their life the way that they are out there, because they're being forced out of it. And that's the part that's really disturbing to me, is that we're losing our privacy because we're being forced out of those type of situations. I mean, you see that those type of true vocations, where it was like the good old American way, not even good old American way, just the way things were done before, the turn of the century, it's just rapidly changing. And now everybody works in tech. Basically, almost every major job that's out there now is involved in some way or another with tech. And
Not
it becomes
necessarily.
tied in. I mean, there's jobs out there that are not tech, but I guess what I'm trying to say is not necessarily tech companies, but our lives are inexorably touched by technology.
Oh yeah, sure, I'll give
and
you
our
that.
jobs are. So like even if you work at I mean Burger King or McDonald's or something, you're working with technology all day. If you're working just pick a vocation and you're working with computers and things all day. Whereas like somebody who's owns a farm may have like a computer in the back room somewhere because they need to use it every once in a while. But and the reason I'm harping on technology, I think, is because that's where we're losing our privacy because we're getting so while we're getting so integrated with technology, while we're doing that as a society, we have to give up. There's all these things that we have to give up, and I don't want to sound conspiratorial here, but I feel like um, that's a purposeful thing. That we're being pushed towards that. Um, but at the same time, it's something that people want too. Like nobody wants to be a farmer.
Oh,
I'm not saying that people. I mean, very few. And when I say nobody, I mean like it's a low percentage of the population, but very few people want to be a farmer there because as you're growing up in the schools, you're being told again to bring this back to our initial topic of homeschooling and being weird and not fitting in. You're a weirdo now if you want to be a farmer because like what the heck? Why do you want to do that? Why don't you want to work in like the medical profession or don't you want to work as a lawyer or something like that? So that's why I feel like it's becoming so weird. It's becoming so anti countercultural to want those and to be those things. I don't know. I feel like I'm not necessarily making my point as well as I want to, but I guess I feel like we're losing our options almost. Like we can still do those things, but we're made to feel like we can't. If that
yeah,
makes sense.
I think it makes sense. I mean, I know a lot of people who want to be farmers. And maybe I think maybe it might be a cultural thing too, because correct me if I'm wrong. You guys haven't, like you and your family, even from when you were a child, like you guys never really lived in a very rural place. Like you typically lived in cities, right, or more urban environments.
Not necessarily. We lived in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, which is pretty rural.
There's
And
not
we
farmers
also,
on Cape Cod though.
well, yeah, you don't have to have farmers to be rural, but
Right.
it's very sparse. The people down the street from us, the dude was making a boat. He made a boat from scratch so he could sail around the world. The guy right down the road from us. So there's some interesting characters. It's just a different world because it's so everybody knows each other's business, that type of stuff. So I've lived in like those type of areas, and I loved it. Um, because I mean, I we had a huge backyard with a forest and trails back there. My sister and I would run around barefoot, and just play back in those areas, and it was the most fun. We didn't sit around and play games. We didn't watch TV because we really barely had a TV, and I loved it. And it's weird to say that because I live in Los Angeles now, which is like one of the most densely packed areas. But it almost feels like this sort of like pipe dream to want to get back to those things because it's like, gosh, if I did move somewhere more rural, if I did become I'm just using farmers as an example, but if I wanted to do something like that, if I wanted to go more off grid, how would I support myself? We're you know what I mean? Like it feels like a almost like a difficult thing, at least where I live, in the situation I'm in.
Yeah, I don't. I think that it depends more on where you're at. I mean, because for instance, I was born and raised in Florida for the most part until I was about 10, and then we moved to Southern Indiana. We were up near Chicago for like a year, maybe I think it's more like 6 or 8 months. But we ended up moving down to Southern Indiana, which we lived in the city, like on the outskirts of the city. We were in Bloomington, Indiana, which is the home of Indiana University. So it's a city, it's developed and everything, but there's lots and lots of farmland around there. And so a lot of the guys I knew from high school, middle school, and high school, they were going to grow up and be farmers. They were your typical rednecks, and there's nothing against that. I mean, we need farmers. That's just a fact of life. Um, when we moved back down to Florida afterwards, um, there was a lot of farmers down there. I don't know if you are aware of this, but Florida has more like livestock farm animals per capita than Texas. I mean, it's a lot of farmers down there. Um, and you even go down like where we're at now in Columbia, we're in the capital city. and I can go 20, 30 miles outside of the city, and there's farmers everywhere, and there's a lot of people here who that's their livelihood, that's what they want to do, that's what their kids want to do. They want to take over the family farm, and that's what they want to do. And I think it just depends on where you're at. I mean, if you're in Los Angeles, California, you're not going to necessarily find a lot of people who want to be farmers. Or if you're living in Tampa, Florida, you're not going to find a lot of people who want to be farmers or something like that. I can
Yeah,
imagine.
I'd be curious to, and I guess I wasn't trying to say that there's a lack of farmers now, but I'd be curious to see the percentage, as in like percentage, like demographic wise, of like, how many farmers are there per capita in the United States today, 2018 versus, 1950. I'd be willing to bet large sums of money that it's quite a bit of a smaller percentage now.
Well, probably because now, I mean, it depends on how you define a farmer, though. Like, are we talking just the owner of the farm? Or are we talking farm hands or what?
Just
Because,
anybody involved with the business.
well, I mean, maybe it's bigger than you think because you got to consider there's probably fewer farms now per se like than there was back in those older times, but they're also bigger, more industrialized farms that need more farm hands. They're also more automated, so maybe not. But back
There's a lot of
then,
it.
back in the 19 early 1900s, 1920s, 1930s, you had a lot more small farms, like family farms, that would be for the community. Whereas now we have these big, huge national industrialized farms that produce the money, or not the money, the food for the entire country and parts of the entire world. I mean, a lot of our food goes overseas as humanitarian aid.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I do think some of the factors that contribute to at least my perspective definitely is the area that I live in. Um, I guess for me, like I progressively moved into larger and larger. So I moved from like small town to like larger, 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 and it kept getting bigger and bigger. Because before I lived in LA, I lived in Houston, and before that, I lived in Orlando, which so you could see the decreasing size of the areas that I lived in as far as population numbers. Um, but I guess and it was probably my mistake to use farmers as the analogy. It's just sort of like a general term for me to like express of like the numbers of people who are are going to be less dependent on technology just by vocation. Um, and there's other occupations out there that are less dependent on technology, I'm sure. I'm just not thinking of those off the top of my head. But and I think just the point that I was trying to make is that we're being herded out of these areas and basically into ghettos, technological ghettos. And it's not necessarily like a physical ghetto. It's not like a there here's the walls, this is it, these are the boundaries you get to play in, and here's your prison cell. That's not what I'm saying, but metaphorically. And the reason I say that is because if you look at society today, again, Google, pick your article, whatever, people have their noses shoved in their mobile devices. They have their heads in their computers and their and all manner of things, and they're always connected. And everybody has a social media platform, or excuse me, a social media um, uh, what do you call it? Account. I don't
Yeah,
even know the right
account.
term for that. But so many people have those things. I don't. I've gotten rid of all of my social media accounts. I'm not necessarily trying to like brag or anything, say I'm great because I've done that, but I just feel like that's the trend is we're being herded into these ghettos, and again, get by ghetto, I just mean a place where everybody can and be, and it's it's just troubling to me because like like with the schooling system that we talked about at the beginning, everybody starts to act and look and behave the same way or in similar ways and have similar goals because everybody's hanging out together and everybody has the teachers that are telling them the same, giving them the same information. Everybody's getting the same information from the same sources. So inevitably, higher numbers of people are going to come to similar conclusions as to what they want to do for a living, what they want to do, and that's why you see so many people as adults going like, man, when I was a kid, I wanted to be an artist, or I wanted to be an astronaut, or you know, I wanted to be a cowboy or something like that, and then, but when I grew up, I realized that's pretty crazy. Nah, I could have done that. It's like, well, sure, you could have. You could have done any of those things. You just bought into what you were told, what the information is that you had in front of you. You bought into it, whether it was true or not. You believed it. So, and that's what that's what essentially like the social media platforms are doing now, is like, we're all getting the same information, getting recycled, and put through a blender. And I think you used the term echo chamber before. It becomes an echo chamber, and everybody who's doing the same things, everybody suddenly, people's goals aren't necessarily even career based. They're like, I want to have like 50,000 followers on my social media. I want to have 100,000 followers on my YouTube. Everybody, wants, all these young kids, you want to do that kind of stuff. That's the new career goals, is to have something, have a platform like that. That's like sort of like what's in vogue. And it's a little bit scary to me, because it's like it's so superficial. I mean, so many of the things, like the whole point of social media is superficiality. You have a profile that shows your best side with your selfies, and videos that are shot from the best angles with the best lighting, and everybody wants to have that stuff. And we're going to talk about the makeup tutorials, and we're going to talk about like how you can dress better. I've got my blog that shows like how you can dress in better ways, and have like and collect more stuff that you don't need. Consumer mindset. I feel like it's all leading into that stuff, like just consume, echo chamber. Everybody wants the same thing because it's more integrated now. Everything's more integrated.
Yeah, which I mean, honestly, I don't think you planned it this way, but that actually kind of ties in with the second half of that original article we were talking about with the homeschool kids and stuff. It talks about this 1950s psychologist named Solomon Asch, I think is how you pronounce his last name. He's a Polish psychologist, and he did a series of experiments back then to test the dangers of group influence. And it says, according to the article, it says, when presented with a simple problem, 95% of individuals could answer correctly. When they were not being influenced by the group. But when they were in a group answering the same question, that 95% number dropped to 75% because they were conforming to the group mentality, or group think, if you want to call it.
You're seeing other people's answers and going, "Oh, that must be right," without really giving it true thought.
Right, and so then
part of it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then it goes into a study by a neuroscientist named Gregory Burns. It was a study done in 2005. Where he did the same exact kind of thing that Asch had done before, but he did it with brain scans at the same time to kind of tell how the brain was reacting to those same scenarios. And what he found was, there's a quote here from the experiments. Is there a quote from Susan Cain? Never mind, that was the wrong quote. Sorry. Basically, what he found was that the people who decided to still answer correctly what they knew was correct, even though it was opposed to what the group had said that was incorrect, that there was within the brain, that there were parts of it that were going off that had to do with stress and anxiety, because they were going against the grain of what was supposed to be the socializing aspect of it, the herding, as you would call it. Anyways, it's a fascinating read. So anyone, I'll have this in the show notes too, but you guys should go and read it. It also talks about they've done like 133 of these Asch type studies in 17 different countries, and it talks about the results of them and everything like that. But it all kind of goes in with conformity, and I think as you become an adult, you still have those basic instincts and those basic responses to things. The only thing I really struggle with is the idea of its the connection to technology, as far as it. Are you saying that technology is being used to manipulate and control, or are you talking about like it's just a part of human nature?
I think it's a natural byproduct of the technology we use. I don't necessarily think it's like nefariously being used to control anyone. Okay. I don't think that there's like some powerful power structure back there going like, yeah, control everybody through the technology. No, I think it's a natural product of becoming, and that's why I'm using the term integration with, so we're integrating society with technology. And integration by its very definition just means to become one, and come together and become one. And that's what happened. And I think part of that's what social media is doing too, is because it's creating even an even greater herd mentality. Because isn't that the true example of herd mentality? Is like, well, if everybody else is, if a high percentage of people is believes a certain way, then it's probably right. Like that's what it is. Like that's a very simplistic definition, but that's, if I'm part of the herd, I'm going to be like, well, yeah, everybody else is doing it, so it must be the right way to go. I'm going to go ahead and follow them,
Yeah.
and not really think too much about what, the right thing really is. And that's what it is. And part of that is peer pressure. Part of that is just, being lazy. There's definitely different parts that come together to make something like that happen. And I don't think there's any one way like people think that creates that problem, because I do think some people are going to be responding more on one hand to maybe peer pressure, like, I just don't want to, have the stress of being different than anybody else, because what is everybody going to think of me? While other people are just being lazy, like going like, everybody else is probably right, so you might as well go with that. And I'm sure there's others who are thinking at it from a different angle too, from different angles that I haven't even thought of. But the point being that all of these roads lead to Rome. So technology, just by its very nature and integration into society, is leading to a greater herd mentality, a greater integration. And I think that's the disturbing part to me. So like the more and more people think alike, the less creativity there is, the less true creativity there is. I mean, have you listened to music lately? And just in general, any music, it all sounds the same. And I'm not trying to like pick on anybody. I'm not trying to pick on musicians or anything, but everybody's listening to the same stuff and saying this is cool. Everybody likes to hear it, so I'm going to make more music just like that, maybe with my own little twist on it. But this is what people like, so this is what we're going to do.
Yeah, I like weird music though, and I'm also old. I've recognized that I'm old. I'm in that old man stage now, to where like I just like what I liked like 10 years ago, and so I just kind of listen to that stuff. But like I'm actually, speaking of music, this is kind of a tangent side note, but I've been really getting into this. It's not chiptune. It's like this new genre that I've discovered. It's probably not new, but it's new to me. It's called synthwave, and it's really good. It's mostly instrumental stuff, but I think I played a song of it for you previously, but. Anyways, if you're into good music, check that out. I'll have a link in the show notes to some guys. But
Yeah.
but yeah, no, yeah, a lot of music that today seems like it. I remember hearing that same argument from my parents, 10, 15 years ago, though. So I kind of wonder if it's that everything is it's conformity, or if it's just like, because music 10, 15 years ago didn't all sound the same. Like, their genre sounded the same because genres are supposed to sound similar. Like Queens of the Stone Age does not sound all that dissimilar from Foo Fighters.
Yeah, that's the illustration. I'm not saying country music sounds the same as hip hop.
Oh, I think country music sounds the same as every other country song.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that within each genre, and there's even subgenres now, that the music is very hard. Like, I listen to all kinds of music at work because I sit at my desk and design stuff all day. So I'm listening to music, and there's times, and it's new music, where I'm going like, did I just hear that or something? But it's a completely different song, but it has a very similar, pattern to it and whatnot. And I'm very musically inclined, so I can detect that stuff. I mean, I played, instruments, as I was growing up all the way through high school, could read music very well and understand music theory. So I'm, don't, for anybody out there who thinks that I don't know what music is or anything about it, I do. And I can detect patterns very easily in notes and all that stuff. So, and yeah. It's just what it is. Like it's very similar. And go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, for any doubters, I remember one time, I think we were up on Cape Cod visiting your family, and you picked up a guitar and you hadn't played it before, and you just picked it up and started playing a song. And I was like, I've been playing for 3 years and I can't play that well. So, yeah, Chris knows what he's talking about when it comes to music stuff. I mean, I like music. I've listened to a lot of music. Like, I have a good ear for music when it comes to, like. You remember that movie Seen It, or that game Seen It, where like they play like a clip from a movie and you have to guess what it was?
Vaguely.
It was an older game. They haven't done it in a while. They had a music variant called Heard It, where like they would play like bits of the. There's an old game that was similar to it, but they'd play like a part of a song, or they'd show like a deconstructed album art, and you have to guess. Like, I remember always doing really well on those, but yeah, I mean, like, so we know what we're talking about with music stuff. It's just, yeah, it seems like a lot of the stuff nowadays. I feel like maybe that started back around 2006 or 7. I I remember there were a few beats that were prevalent in a lot of songs back then that are still like kind of the norm, the standard today. Um,
Exactly. Let me use it, and let me use another example just for illustrative purposes because I'm a designer, so I can, I'll share this. Cars, and you always have, remember your parents or grandparents going, all the cars today look the same, and that's like 15, 20 years ago when you were a kid, and you're like, nah, I know all the differences between the cars, but the point isn't that the cars look the same because you don't know what they are, for at least from my view. The point is that they're using very, very similar design elements because that's what is looking good. So to give a point, and for those of you who are familiar with cars, you might get this easier than me, but a lot of cars use what now is a trapezoidal form for the grill. So they have these trapezoidal grills, and a trapezoid is basically like I'll make it with my, I don't know if I can make it with my hands, but imagine there's a flat, like this is the triangle. It's like a rectangle with slanted edges. Okay. So like a triangle with the top cut off of it. So you pick a car and a car brand, and they all have these grills now. It's a trapezoidal grill. It's bigger on top and smaller on the bottom, or vice versa. And whereas, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, we didn't see hardly any of those. I think maybe Audi had it, and that was it. So I'm using that example because I'm a designer and I can recognize patterns in design as well. And I'm not necessarily an old fogey just going, oh, all cars look the same. They do look the same because they're using similar design cues with little different, sort of little different frills and here and there and whatnot, little quirks, but to each brand. But they're all designing the same thing out there. You got the slanted headlights, with the trapezoidal grill, big giant trapezoidal grill and a huge logo on it now on the front, and sloped windshields, even the SUVs. There's nothing boxy anymore. Okay, like nobody's gonna buy that because that's what everybody's making. That's successful, So I and again to bring that back home, because we've used the example of design in cars and we've used music sounding the same. That's sort of like things are becoming more. That's just there to illustrate that things are becoming more and more integrated. And I think again, it's just that sort of like echo chamber type of thing. It's like everybody's hearing themselves. Oh, that sounds great. Oh yeah, this is great. Let's do it this way because it just keeps on working. So and I just see that pattern continuing and in fact intensifying, and that's what's concerning to me, and it has been intensifying over a long period of time. So we're sort of seeing like a what do you call it? A culmination of things, because society is changing so much more rapidly than it did even 20 years ago. You can see the speed of life. Everything's speeding up. From the turn of the 20th century, even you can see how fast life speeds up. The amount of information that's shared. So everything is just speeding up. It's going to continue to do that until it's just at a more and more frenetic pace. And people are just going to keep, sounding more and more similar, I'm afraid. And it's going to come down. And I think where this is headed isn't just necessarily vocational, but I think the thing that scares me the most is belief centers. So like religion, thought processes, psychological thought processes. That's what's the scariest part, because the Bible says that in the last days there's going to be one world religion, right? And I don't know why I'm going here, but I feel like the only way to that is that you continue honing and honing and honing and honing until everything comes together and makes more sense. I just that's where I see it headed, because so often now with with Twitter and these different memes that are going around with like race wars and the Me Too stuff and everything. Everybody's sort of like getting into that echo chamber and wanting to be a part of it. That's the thought processes, I guess. What would you call it, Dan? Would like psychological thought processes? It's like the psychosis behind it, I guess. Everybody wants to be a part of that.
Groupthink.
Those movements to be part of
Groupthink.
it.
They want to be, but that's what it manifests in. It manifests in groupthink. I know what you're saying, but and the thing is that the media, when we watch the news and we read articles and we're focused on what is being presented to us, it can skew our perspective on it. Because I know um, the news has been really depressing and aggravating, and frankly, it's just kind of pissed me off a lot lately. So I've kind of just taken a break from it. And the more I've stepped back from it, and the more I've engaged with actual people, and that I know people that are in my community that are around, like people that I used to work with when I worked day shift, and I kind of stick around sometimes after work to get to hang out with them a little bit. Um, the more I realize, hey, the world is somewhat sane, and I've actually started noticing even people who were further on the fringes on both sides of any particular debate or argument have. There's still the outliers who are just trying to be jerks, but there's also the ones that are like, okay, things are getting a little too extreme here. And I think you may have touched on that in the last week's episode, if I remember correctly. You brought it, maybe you didn't, maybe it was somebody else I was listening to. Brought up, I can't remember her name, but she was a prolific feminist writer, really well known, really well respected as a leader in the feminist movement. And even she was coming down on this whole Me Too movement because it was becoming a witch hunt.
I forget her name, but I know who you're talking about. And then
Yeah.
she's getting backlash from it, right?
Yeah, they're like, saying that she's not. I'm like, she's like one of your most prolific feminist writers and thinkers from the last 50 years.
He's like
And
one of the people that sort of helped set foundations for that movement.
exactly. And so I feel like there is a pushback with reason and rationale, and you're right. The Bible does talk about that happening in the end times. So, which is one of the reasons why, when I look at end times prophecy, I believe that we are living in the end times, but I don't necessarily think we're as far along as some people may think we are. Which could be another fun discussion for another time. And I talk about it on occasion in my other podcasts, but um, I don't know. I just think it's interesting. I do think it's interesting the way things are going, but in the end, I think it all comes back to the purpose of pushing these narratives, the purpose of the media coming at us with these perspectives of showing us that this is, they're trying to normalize the more extremist behaviors of people that are in like these kind of movements and stuff like that, which
I
don't reflect the average citizen. They don't reflect the average American. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to normalize it so that when we see it, we think that we're the one that are a minority and we need to conform, which is kind of what this article was talking about. It talks about it's hard for someone to speak up then. Um, Man, there's so much here. It's getting deeper and deeper. It's really fun to kind of process and think about. But I think also what we end up having to realize is that we're not alone, and we're not the only people who are thinking rationally about this. And for everyone who thinks that they are the only one, it kind of reminds me of the story of Elijah in the Bible when he would after he confronted the prophets of Baal, he was run off into the wilderness because Jezebel, the queen, wanted to kill him because of what he had done. Um, and as a result, he goes off into the wilderness and he's crying out to God because he's afraid that, he's the only one left. He's the only true prophet of God left who believes, and everyone else has fallen away or been killed. And God's like, "Man, I've got like thousands more people. You're good. Don't worry about it. I got this covered." And I feel like that's kind of where we're at as a society of rational individuals, is that there's a lot more of us out there than we might realize, and we might feel like we're alone because we're watching the news, we're reading things on Facebook and on Twitter and on social media and on these news websites, and they all tend to skew a certain direction, but that's not necessarily reflective of the majority, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think schools are the perfect breeding ground for that type of, um, I guess, training, if you will, because you got young children, young people who are in a very developmental process, figuring out very much who they are as individuals, and that's a very difficult time for anybody because you want to feel comfortable, as we said in the beginning. But I think that as they're you can get, if you can get people in the earliest stages and develop them and train them essentially to think in a certain way as a group, as a herd, and have that type of mentality, then that's going to carry through. That type of mentality is going to carry through throughout their lives, unless there's some sort of an event or some sort of an like a red pill moment, if you will, or some sort of an awakening to like, hey, you know what? I don't have to think just like everybody else does. I don't have to believe this stuff just because everybody else is saying it or doing it and or promoting it. Um, and I think that's a really big step in if it's a really big step to take, a very scary step to take, especially if that's what you've grown up. The only type of social interaction that you've really known growing up is to, hey, let's be cool, let's all hang out together and do nothing. And I mean, because really, like when you're in high school, isn't that what partying is all about? You can just hang out and do nothing. You go to somebody's house who's probably going to get in trouble the next day from their parents, and go drink a bunch of stuff that doesn't even taste good, and get messed up, and risk getting in trouble, risk getting killed in like a car accident, or there's so many risks. But hey, everybody else is doing it, and we all get to hang out together and talk about things that don't even it doesn't even really matter. And maybe, hey, I get to hook up with somebody or whatever. And I mean, just talking about that, it's just like, gosh, could you think of like a more like superficial, pointless way to live your life, like, and continue to do that, weekend after weekend after weekend? But that's what a lot of people are getting essentially trained to do, from a very young age, because that's just how it is. So
I'll be honest with you. I was never exactly invited to a lot of parties at school, so I'm like, I never really had that experience, I guess. But I know what you're saying, and I know a lot of people who did that kind of stuff, and I feel like that's probably, I don't know. I feel like the more and more that I analyze the American culture, the American society, even the Western, not even necessarily the American culture and society, which there are aspects that you can appreciate, obviously, but the more I start to realize, like, our level of hedonism is not beneficial to the society as a whole, if that makes sense.
no, it's not. Anytime you're focused on yourself, and your own gratification, that it's a very unfulfilling existence. It seems like, yeah, from that standpoint, if you're focused on yourself and taking care of yourself and your own needs, that should be fulfilling, right? But the strange thing is, as humans, and that's part of, like, feel like the human existence and the mystery of who we are and created to be, is that taking care of ourselves doesn't satisfy us. It doesn't leave us with a feeling of like, ah, yeah, this is life, this is how it should be. And maybe it is for a while, but at some point you realize, hey, you know what? There's more to life. There's got to be more to life than this. And it takes some people a lot longer of a time than it takes other people. Some people don't ever realize it, and they take it to their grave. And that's a very unfortunate thing. And some people get it at a much younger age. But I think that's one of life's great mysteries as to why, taking care of yourself doesn't really make you feel better. Taking care of your own needs, it's just sort of like putting a band-aid over something. What we really need as human beings is true love, social interaction, or not social interaction, but like we need to help others. We need to be in a lifestyle where we're looking to help other people benefit more than we're looking to help ourselves benefit, and we see a greater purpose in things through a creator who made us to be that way, and to serve rather than to be served, because the person who lived that life greatest, being Jesus, was this labeled himself as the servant of all. That's what he said. He never exalted himself. He never glorified himself. He never made a big deal out of himself, even though he could have. And he could have done all these amazing things being God, but he didn't. And I feel like that's the lifestyle example that we should all be following. I know that the periods of time throughout my life where I've gotten closest to emulating that particular lifestyle is where I've actually felt the most fulfilled, the most at peace, the most in agreement, so to speak, with my situations, and not worried about how much money I was going to make, how much stuff I was going to have, who I was going to impress, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if you want to speak to that at all, but I feel like that's, rather than being part of the societal norm and trying to serve ourselves and make ourselves feel great, don't you think that's a better way to go?
Yeah. I mean, there's a benefit to taking care of yourself. Like sometimes you just gotta unplug and have, like, for me, I'm an introverted individual. I'm not one of those guys who uses that as an excuse to be antisocial, but I do recognize that especially when I work day shifts at the zoo, that um, I could only take being around people so much, and on a busy Saturday, when I'm literally around 10,000 people all day long, I had to come home and unwind a little bit before I could continue to be around more people. And so there's an element of that, but as Christians, our response should not be to remove ourselves and seek our own. You kept using the word needs. I don't know if I would use the word. I think I would use the word desires or wants. I think it might be a better descriptor for it. For instance, like I want a Nintendo Switch because I like to play video games, and the Switch is pretty cool. And I don't need to spend $300 though, so it's something that I would like to have. I could go and spend that $300 on that, or I could take that $300 and help a friend who maybe is trying to raise support to go over to Africa, whether for a short-term mission trip or long-term mission trip, or even just for a trip they've always wanted to take but they can't afford it. So I could do that, or I could use that $300 to buy some new clothes for my kids, so something like that. So I think of a need more as, okay, I need to unwind after being around 10,000 people for the last 8 hours. Otherwise, I'm probably going to be kind of short-tempered with my kids and with anyone who comes over. But also, as believers, our recognition should be that our dependence is on God Himself. And so, while I need to unwind, so I'm not short-tempered, I don't need to be beholden to my natural self and my natural state of being ill-tempered after being around that many people for that long. And so then that is then incumbent upon me as a believer to say, okay, Jesus, I need your help because I can't do this in my own flesh and my own natural disposition. So I need you to help me. And that's when the Holy Spirit kicks in. That's a theological perspective of mine. But, I don't think there's anything wrong with, there's nothing wrong with wanting to, there's nothing wrong with wanting to do nice things. Like we want to take a vacation out to the Grand Canyon sometimes. That's not a need. That's a want. And I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to do that. But a lot of times our culture does put such an emphasis on fulfilling your needs and your wants to where it's at the detriment of others, which is why, we see people who, I can't remember the example, but, you see somebody who's maybe looking a little down or frustrated or just kind of upset about something. And how many times have we done this where we see that and we just look down or we look away or we look at our phone because we don't want to deal with it. And so rather than taking the time to say, hey man, you doing okay? Can I do anything to help you out? We just walk on by because we don't want to hassle with it. And that's, I think, a good, simple way to look at it to where we can all relate to it. Because if we're honest, I think most of us, if not all of us, have at some point in time done that. Because that person's weird, or they smell funny, or I'm busy and I just don't feel like dealing with it, or I'm ill-tempered because I've been around 10,000 people today, so I don't want to deal with it. And that's one of those things where, yeah, it would be better for us, it would be better for them, it would be better for us, our entire society if we would be more like that, which is a Christ-like attitude. But I also feel like we can go to, there's a balance. You don't want to go to one extreme or the other. You don't want to give of yourself so much to where there's nothing left to give. But you also don't want to give to the communal side of things. You don't want to, the collectivist mentality of the individual doesn't matter, because the individual does matter. And I feel like it can become a very irresponsible way to look at human existence, to say that the individual does not matter, the collective matters. That's how you end up having individuals getting trampled and the rights being taken away from individuals, if that makes sense. Whereas everyone else, when everybody has illicit rights that belong to everybody as individuals, that builds a stronger collective, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think, well, looking at Christ's life as an example, he was all about the individual, that the individual matters. He actually shied away from crowds too. So, I mean, we look at like the Sermon on the Mount, when he spoke before the 5,000 and etc. He would always sort of like take off from those places and just hang out with the disciples, or he'd end up healing individuals, or speaking with individuals. The woman at the well comes to mind, where he just stopped and talked to this woman who's at a well, right? He had such a tremendous impact on her life that she went back into the town where people thought she was like this kind of promiscuous woman and weird, and she was like, hey, she went to tell them. So yeah, I think the Christ-like lifestyle is all about the individual. It's all about celebrating the individual, and not necessarily at the cost of like yourself, but I think it's more about not letting your thoughts center on yourself, at least not for too long. Because what ends up happening is, if you become too introspective and you become so thoughtful about that, you end up getting wrapped up in your problems, because we all have real problems. But as we know, the best way to medicate problems is to become distracted from them. And there's better distractions. Some distractions are better and more helpful, as you were saying, than others. One of the things that I've done in the past to sort of self-medicate whenever I've been stressed out about things and I want to get away from people, is like, I end up shopping. I'll buy something online. I'll be like, oh, let me get that thing that I've been thinking about for a while that I felt like I needed, and then you end up getting, you go on Amazon, you buy it, and two days later it shows up on your doorstep, and you're like, oh yeah, I feel so great, I got this thing. And then but then you end up back at that same spot of like, it didn't really change my life how I thought it was going to change my life, or if I had this house, it would change my life. If I had this car, it would change my life. If I had this woman, it would change my life. If I had this job, it would change my life. And we keep going from thing to thing to thing that we feel like is going to help us, when the real thing that's going to help us is not us and taking care of us, in the sense of like, I need to get this stuff, I need to acquire this stuff for myself, but I need to actually give and help, and where I can, and keep my mind, my thoughts away from myself, more towards God, and more in that direction, than on myself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I don't know what to add to that. Yeah, that's good stuff. Not to cut it off, but this episode's getting a bit on the long side, and you threw a link my way a while ago that I thought maybe we could, if you want to touch on, it's a little Seth Rich news. So, for anyone who's not aware of the Seth Rich situation, I would say go back to like, what was it, like episode 2, 3, 4, something like that. It was one of the early episodes, and we talked a bit about Seth Rich. He was a DNC staffer during the election.
6. Capitol cover-up.
Capitol cover-up. Thank you. Yes. So, what you said, that was 6?
Episode 6.
Okay, so go check out episode 6. It's Capitol cover-up. It was about the conspiracy of Seth Rich's murder. So it was one of those situations, just to kind of brief recap. If you want more in-depth coverage of it from our angle, you can go and check out that episode. But he was a DNC staffer during the election last year. He's part of the Democratic National Committee, but he was a Bernie supporter, and I believe he was an IT guy, if I'm not mistaken. I think he was working with computers.
The head of their IT, I think.
Okay, maybe he was the head of IT. So anyways, he acquired access to DNC emails, I think, between like the Hillary Clinton campaign and maybe Debbie Wasserman Schultz or some other people, talking about how the DNC was basically screwing Bernie Sanders out of opportunities for the nomination. And he was a Bernie fan. He got pissed off about it. And so the theory is that he leaked the information to WikiLeaks. So people talk about the Russian hacking of the DNC emails, which technically the evidence points otherwise, but I'm not going to get into all that right now. The primary story, the cover-up story, as we would say, is that the Russians hacked the DNC, stole the emails, and released them through WikiLeaks. The other perspective is that they were leaked to WikiLeaks by Seth Rich because he was frustrated with what they were doing, because of the way they were rigging the primary elections. And because of that, he was killed. He was shot in D.C. I believe he was on his way to the Capitol to testify against Hillary Clinton before Congress. And he was killed in a mugging gone wrong, is the official story. And in which he was shot twice in the back. They didn't take his wallet. They didn't take any of his money. didn't take his watch that he like his smartwatch he was wearing or something like that. Basically, everything that would have been worth mugging or worth taking from somebody who was mugged was left on his body, and so apparently there's some news regarding it. So, Chris, take it away. Let us know what the news is.
Yeah, and to add to the suspicion of the mugging that you just mentioned, where apparently he was mugged for no reason, yet none of his stuff was taken. He was actually mugged outside of a establishment, like a bar, basically, and there was videotape footage of it. I use the term videotape loosely. It might have been digital video footage, but somebody, some independent investigators thought, it might be a good idea to talk to the owner of that establishment to see if there's see what's up with that. And when they did talk to the owner of that establishment, he said that the FBI or some organization showed up and basically confiscated the video information. So in other words, like all of the recording of that day or that night when it happened. So that's not suspicious at all, is it? I don't think so. Nah. And so the latest news is in relation to, I don't know if you guys are going to be familiar with this guy or not. He goes by the screen name Kim.com on Twitter. He's sort of like a tech guy. He's from New Zealand. Let me see here. Pull it up. He's like a tech. He's an entrepreneur, a New Zealand entrepreneur he made all these assertions and claims that he knew before all of the hacking emails stuff came out, that it wasn't hacking, that it was actually a person, and that he knew because he knew Seth Rich personally. So the interesting thing is that Robert Miller is the person who's in charge of the investigation for the DNC leaks, and he's basically sticking to the published story as far as this is what we're looking for in terms of crime, which is that the Russians hacked the United States. And of course, the Russian hacking was sort of put forth by a cybersecurity firm named CrowdStrike, basically, who published a paper essentially with no information at all. I remember reading this. It was like an 8-page document, and there was essentially no evidence directly pointing towards Russia or anything other than that some Russian, I believe, keystrokes were used, or Russian alphabet was used in some of the purported malware, essentially, that they said had to do with it, even though there was no evidence connecting the malware with the DNC event. So oddly enough, there was like two different disconnects there. We've got, that just having Russian keystrokes in malware does not incriminate Russians, number one. And number two, disconnect is that there was no malware that was detected essentially for the DNC event, because none was used, because it was downloaded. The information was downloaded and put onto a zip drive or a flash drive and taken. That's why there was no evidence of a hacking. In fact, CrowdStrike later on, they retracted some of those claims that they made about the Russian hacking. So, but apparently Robert Miller didn't get that memo, because he's still continuing to investigate the Russia aspect of this. But I'm just going to share with you guys a couple tweets that Kim.com has shared within about the last couple months, because I think they're important. Let's see here. I don't know if that's big enough to be able to see. Let me change the window size. Is that any better? That might be better. Okay, that looks like it's better. Kim.com, in one of his tweets, this is dated February 18th this year, 2018. He says, "Let me assure you, the DNC hack was not even a hack. It was an insider with a memory stick. I know this because I know who did it and why. Special counsel Mueller is not interested in my evidence. My lawyers wrote to him twice. He never replied. 360 pounds. Apparently, he's a heavy guy. So he's reached out, evidently, if we can infer from this tweet, he's reached out to the Miller investigation saying that he has information to share and they will not reply to him. And March 1st, so this is just 2 days ago, he wrote, "Reminder, Here's the first letter my lawyers wrote to special counsel Mueller regarding Seth Rich. We never received any reply. It's astonishing considering my firsthand knowledge of the DNC leak. And here's the link to that letter. May 20th. So this is right after May 20th, 2017. This tweet is dated, and that's right after the leaks happened. I knew Seth Rich. I know he was the WikiLeaks source. I was involved. So we have this gentleman who's sharing this information, basically saying he has information regarding, excuse me, Seth Rich, and yet we're not getting any. He's not getting any type of a response from the investigation that is handling the investigators, excuse me, that are handling the event. So to add that on top of the missing footage, the missing security cam footage from outside the venue where Seth Rich was allegedly killed, allegedly mugged, it's just really kind of a smoking gun, in my opinion, and it just reeks of some sort of cover-up. And I'm not suggesting that, that I know all of the information, or that even, some of the people who's, the Twitter that I've shared here, Kim.com, I'm not saying that he even knows all the information or what he's sharing is even true. But what I am saying is the information, it seems that there's information being withheld from the public. And why is that happening? Anytime information is being withheld, to me, that's just a giant red herring. And it's just concerning. So to me, why would they want to hide any additional information from this investigation? It would be because you want people to continue to believe the cover story. You want to keep the investigation going in the direction you already have it, which is the Russia investigation. The Russians did it. The Russians hacked. So it's just, I don't know. Like I said, I'm not claiming to know what happened. I don't know all of the information, but it just reeks of conspiracy, really, with the information that's out there.
Yeah, I mean, I have a very low view of this investigation, anyways. Excuse me. I feel like nobody wants to admit the level of corruption within both parties, really, but in this particular instance, the Democratic Party. And I mean, the implications there are scary if you think about it. And, I feel like the Mueller investigation has turned up some really good evidence, as far as the motive behind any kind of Russian interference, which it wasn't really interference so much as it was, I guess maybe you could say it was interference, but it definitely wasn't like collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians. It's more of a, I think he even said in a recent thing that they were just trying to sow discord, if that makes sense.
Wouldn't it be foolish to believe? In fact, it is foolish to believe that our own government doesn't do that with other countries abroad.
They do.
I mean, and it's just hypocritical for something like that to be called out in the first place. And I am by no means condoning the actions, of the people who are involved with this, because I think it's super corrupt, like you're saying, on both sides, both parties. I am not I'm not up here like shilling for any particular party or any particular side, other than like, let's just get the truth. I just want to know the truth. As a citizen of this country, we deserve to know the truth behind this investigation, one way or the other, whatever it proves to be true. I want to know the truth. And it just doesn't seem like this Russian investigation is necessarily exposing all of the truth. You have what were those two FBI staffers that got in trouble for like basically having those texts where they, the texts that they didn't have, that were deleted and found again, that were super incriminating. I mean, some of the text messages that they shot between each other was that this whole Russian investigation was a sham. This is FBI agents. These are FBI agents, saying this, FBI assets or whatever. saying this, in their private text messages. So things like this getting uncovered. And then you have the ridiculousness, uh, just the hubris of the mainstream media. I think it was CNN went to some lady's house, some old lady's house, and basically, like, she did not know they were coming, and it was one of these, like, hardball reporters just showed up, knocked on the door, and had her come out so he could basically, like, essentially have a, point fingers at her that she was a Russian bot and she was helping Russian collusion, or she was helping the Russians to meddle with the election. And she's like, completely like, what are you talking about? I just have a I just have a Facebook and I'm doing my thing. I'm not helping anybody out.
Yeah,
So that's just the absurdity of it all.
well, and that's one of the things that I find to be an issue. Like, first of all, that reporter, lucky didn't come to my house, okay? Because I would have given him a few good sound bites, if you know what I mean. But I mean, it's like, one, you don't just show up. A reporter should know better than just show up at somebody's house and start accusing them of stuff like that. Yeah, that happens in South Carolina. Probably going to get shot or told very, very directly to leave. But I don't like the direction that this is going, because now we're getting to a point to where if we don't agree with the agenda, or we don't agree with the particular narrative that's being sown, then we are being labeled as I can't really think of what it's called, a label, but it's more of like, if you don't agree with me, you don't agree with the official story, then you are helping, you're aiding and abetting the enemy, if that makes sense. I mean, it's not that far of a cry from the Alien Sedition Act from John Adams' administration. Basically, you say anything. What's that?
And the Red Scare too.
Oh yeah, we're totally in a McCarthyist era right now. I mean, the Russians they're not good. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and defend what the Russians are doing, especially if you get into any of the stuff written by Alexander Dugin. Like, he's got a book called The Fourth Political Theory and Neo-Eurasianism. Both of them are, I would recommend you read them if you haven't already. But he's not a good guy. And a lot of the stuff that, these Russian, hackers, if you want to call them that, or I can't remember the name of the company. There was a company that was just outed as being part of this whole process. It was in the Mueller indictment, actually. But that guy is kind of like the philosophical thought behind it comes from him, and it's this whole idea of sowing discord, because it's trying to demolish Western society, Western civilization as we know it. So by no means am I saying that what they're doing is good, but there's like this Russian hysteria that's sweeping across our country, where everything is the Russians. Like, and it's not new. I mean, like, 5 years ago everything was China. China's doing this, China's doing that, China's doing this and that. And now it's Russia, 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 Russia. Give it another year and a half, maybe it'll be North Korea. We have our boogeymen that we focus on the entire time. But I feel like because there is so much access now, that it's not as concealed as it once was. And because there's so many outlets covering it so often now, and you have independent, I'm not going to call this independent news, but you have independent broadcasters, if you will, like ourselves, and many other podcasts that are out there that are covering these kind of things, giving a more rational approach to it rather than just saying Russia, 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 Russia. People are starting to wake up and see the way that it's being used and being spun by the media, by the governments, by people who have a vested interest in that being the official narrative.
I honestly think it's a straw man. And that's been apparent almost from day one. It's more to serve as a distraction from from other things that are of great import than it is anything else. I mean, it's let's just sit around in a circle and and that's because why else would you continue to beat a dead horse, right? I mean, if you're still haven't turned up any type of any type of evidence after the amount of time that they've gotten, any type of real evidence, like real damning evidence, like let's move on. But I guess then the investigation has to be pretty thorough, and I'm not faulting them for that, because that's very important. And I think that in order to get justice properly, that it does have to be thorough. So I'm definitely not faulting them for taking their time on it either. But at the same time, let's explore. Why can't we explore all avenues, all possible avenues, no matter how crazy they might seem? Again, I'm going to bring it back to this guy, Kim.com. You've got somebody publicly coming out with information that they say that they have, that they want to share as part of the investigation, which I think in a fair world it should be. Even if it sounds crazy or is crazy, you gotta cover your bases if you're going to do it. And it doesn't appear that the Miller investigation is covering its bases completely in this case. If they're not even responding to this gentleman's letters claiming to have information and evidence of this DNC event and how it took place. So, and there's a big difference, as he says, between an actual hack, which is you could probably define better than I can, Dan, but there's a great deal of difference between an actual hack and an incident where you take information, download it onto a hard drive, and take it from away from a particular system. So that's a big difference. And if there is any type of evidence that supports that, it needs to be investigated, and it certainly seems like there is evidence to support that. Some evidence to support that. So I mean, it's a real cluster, that's for sure. But let's go ahead and wrap up. I think I want to close with sort of bringing this show full circle to where we started, and that was with Dan talking about groupthink and sort of like the herd mentality that seems to rear its head especially in our schooling systems. I think, from my perspective, and I think, our viewers, you guys can probably relate to this because we've all gone through school. Some of us were homeschooled, some of us were in public school. But if you were in public school, then you know that there were the different cliques, there were the different groups of people that got along together. But there was, at least in my school, I had this experience where there was there's sort of like the cool kids, that all hang out, and they always ended up going to the parties, the same parties, and hanging out, and they'd all had, like the same stories to share, and, hey, haha, let's all like talk about this stuff and laugh because we have all this in common. And I just wanted to refer to that because I think that type of a mentality, that sort of herd mentality of like, let's all just come together and be, like be cool and like stroke each other's ego is really, it's counterproductive. And, to society and to ourselves as people, I think that what we can really do to move forward with things is to be as inclusive as possible in those avenues. And I think we're seeing that in a certain shape or form in broad strokes in society these days. But with sort of like this Me Too movement and some of the I guess you could call it like civil rights type movement stuff that's going on right now, neo civil rights, I guess you could call it. But I feel like those are very focused, and that's fine. But let's try to come together. Let's find common ground in society other than just trying to discredit people that we see as being on the other team, so to speak. Whether it's left wingers, alt rights, etc. I really think that we need to sort of drop those labels and that we like to throw around so much, because in essence that's not much different of a concept than it is to call people of a different race derogatory names, in the sense that we're and when you're using racism, or when someone racially calls somebody a derogatory name because they're of a different race, essentially that's a label that's being put on that person. And in the sense of a label being put on a person, that's what happens so oftentimes, in school where, you know, somebody's labeled a loser or a nerd or, you know, just, you know, a failure, etc. Um, that's what we really need to move past, I think, to become more unified as a society and stop focusing so much on our differences. But we need to focus on what unifies us. Because yeah, sure, we can find plenty of differences in the color of our skin, in the accents that we speak with, in our preferences, our political preferences. There's differences galore, but let's focus more as a society on our similarities. That what makes us human, because that's where we can find the common ground to really truly move forward and make progress. And we don't need to, and for that to happen, we don't need to have everybody have the exact same belief structure. We don't need to have everybody religiously believe the same way. We don't need to have everybody, you know, believe in the same political system or monetary system even. It's not about that. It's about finding common ground in the human condition and being able to move and look past our differences and create something that's truly constructive in society. And that's to be able to live together, to coexist and help each other out. So I just want to encourage you guys to help to promote that type of a lifestyle where we move past our differences. It's not about political parties. It's not about necessarily belief systems. That's not what it's about. It's not about finding the right team to fit in. We should, I guess, we need to celebrate our differences. We need to celebrate our differences. We're all going to have different ideas and different perspective on things, and that's okay. It's completely okay for that to happen. And I don't need to shut somebody down because they believe differently, and I'm insecure because I'm insecure in my viewpoints. So I just really want to encourage you guys to do that. Whoever's watching this video, just believe in yourself, believe in who you are as an individual, that God made you great, that God made you different from everybody else. Not because you're weird, but because you are your individual self and you have this amazing potential, this amazing creative potential to be whatever you want, to do whatever you want, and to help to push society and humanity forward in a constructive way.
Hear, hear. Well said. I have nothing to add to that one. That's good stuff, man. I don't know. Do you have anything else you want to talk about tonight? Or should we go ahead and close up? All right, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. It's been a longer episode than we usually do, when we were planning on. But I feel like it's been a good one. I feel like we talked about a lot of really good stuff tonight. And yeah, if you guys are interested in finding more of our shows, you can head over to twowiseguys.org, and you can find all the previous episodes except for last week's, which I haven't gotten up yet. So we'll get that soon. But it'll be up before this one comes up on the website. So you can go ahead and check that out. If you want to listen on the go, which might be more convenient for most people, you can also go to the Apple iTunes or iOS podcast app or whatever it's called. We're also on all the Android ones too, or at least all the big ones that I'm aware of. We're not on Spotify. I'm not really sure how to make that work, so maybe we'll figure that out sometime. But you can get the podcast. If you are listening to the podcast, if you wouldn't mind, it would be awesome if you could leave us a rating and or review. That would help us move up in the rankings, and also just kind of give us some feedback on how we're doing. Speaking of feedback, if you want to reach out to us, you can email us at twowiseguys.org@gmail.com, or you can go to the website and hit the contact button at the top and send us a message that way, or you can just leave a message in or comment below, either on the YouTube video or on the website itself. And if you guys are interested in being part of the show and kind of giving some feedback, submitting questions you want us to discuss, you can reach out the same ways, and we'll be happy to get back to you, maybe even bring it up during the show, kind of talk about it that way. As always, every single week we do this live on Saturdays at 7:30 Eastern, give or take, maybe a few minutes late sometimes. That's 4:30 Pacific. My bad. And you can go to YouTube and watch the video live on there and be part of the live chat that we got going on there. Occasionally we get somebody comes in there and starts talking, and it's always a lot of fun to be able to answer questions on the fly, engage with you guys as you're in there. Again, the only rules we have for the show is just have fun, have thoughtful discussion, be civil, things like that. So I don't really have anything else to add, but I had a lot of fun this week. And Chris, did you have anything you want to add?
It's been a blast. Thanks for watching, guys.
Yeah. Until next week, I'm Dan. Chris is over there. We'll see y'all next week.